The bell echoed through the long hallways of Harrison West High, a historic high school where the sounds of students' footsteps and locker doors slamming together formed the familiar morning symphony. However, the atmosphere was completely different in the English literature classroom at the far end of Building C. Silent. Heavy. Miss Lauren Whitaker, a longtime teacher, stood motionless at the podium. Her gray dress was immaculately pressed, her hair was neatly pinned up, and her sharp eyes swept across the rows of seats as if checking for signs of life from each student. Every student sat in absolute silence, not out of respect, but out of fear. Everyone knew there was no room for mistakes in Miss Lauren's class, and even less room for anything different. Suddenly, the classroom door swung open. All eyes turned to the newcomer. Lolita King, a black girl with bright eyes and a confident posture, stepped in. Her backpack hung over one shoulder. She wore simple jeans and held an old, worn notebook in one hand. The air in the room shifted instantly. A wave of whispers, glances, and complex expressions swept through. Some students looked curious, others are cautious, but the only one who didn't bother hiding her reaction was Miss Lauren. The teacher offered a faint smile, not quite friendly but forced and laced with subtext. "Well, it looks like we have a new face today. Please come in, Miss King. Is that correct?" Lolita nodded, replying softly, "Yes, ma'am." Miss Lauren crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly. "I hope you'll be able to keep up with the rather rigorous standards of this class." The way she emphasized the word rigorous seemed to drag the room down a few degrees. A few students chuckled. Lolita didn't react. She quietly found an empty seat in the corner of the room, sat down, and opened her notebook, her pen already in hand and ready. But she knew. The first test had already begun and wasn't part of the curriculum. No one in that room, not even the teacher herself, could have known that this girl's presence would change the entire class, the entire school, and the system as a whole of prejudiced beliefs they once considered normal. The lesson began with the sound of a marker squeaking across the whiteboard. To Kill a Mockingbird. Theme: power and oppression. Miss Lauren turned around, eyes sweeping the classroom, before landing on the front row. Who wants to begin? Any thoughts on how the novel portrays power in society? A few hesitant hands went up, but from the back rows, one hand shot up confidently and decisively. Lolita. There was a brief flicker of hesitation in Miss Lauren's eyes. Then she glanced past Lolita as if she hadn't seen her and pointed to the white student beside her. "Dylan, let's hear from you." Dylan mumbled a few vague statements. Miss Lauren nodded approvingly, praising his response, then asked a few other students, carefully avoiding Lolita's gaze. When she could no longer ignore her, she finally gestured toward her. "Yes, Miss King. Do you have something to add?" Lolita sat up straight, her eyes calm, her voice clear. The book clearly shows how systemic racism affects justice and shapes societal perception. The entire class fell silent for a beat. A few students turned to look at her. The answer was too sharp and too honest. But Miss Lauren only curled her lips into a smirk, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Are you sure you're referring to Kill a Mockingbird and not some political speech you saw on social media?" A few chuckles rippled from the back of the room. Lolita remained composed. "Yes, ma'am. It's a reasonable perspective, based on the book's content and the social context within the story." Miss Lauren slowly walked toward Lolita's desk, her gaze sharp as a blade. "You should focus more on the author's message rather than imposing personal emotions onto literature." The air in the classroom thickened. Some students lowered their heads, pretending not to hear. Others looked at Lolita, both admiring her and fearing for her. As for Lolita, though her hands gripped the edge of her desk just slightly tighter, she didn't blink or take back her words. She knew her teacher was trying to extinguish her voice, but silence was not an option. And in that moment, Miss Lauren realized something too. This girl would not be dismissed as easily as the others. The lesson went on. Questions about metaphors, symbols, and characters followed one after another. But everything had changed from the moment Lolita dared to voice her opinion. Miss Lauren didn't call on her again, even though Lolita kept raising her hand, eyes sharp, filled with determination. Miss Lauren would glance past her and turn away as if she didn't exist. Ava, what do you think? Brent, do you have any thoughts? When Miss Lauren called on someone else, Lolita's hand would quietly lower again, but her gaze remained steady, as if she were writing a protest through her deliberate silence. Some students began to notice something unusual. Sarah, the girl at the front desk, glanced at Lolita, her eyes concerned. Liam, who usually joked around in class, had fallen quiet, staring at his notebook, as if trying to avoid facing what was happening. But others, those who preferred the illusion of order, started to take pleasure in it. A few whispered behind Lolita's back. Some even smirked deliberately every time she raised her hand. Miss Lauren didn't correct them, didn't discipline. They didn't notice. Or perhaps chose not to. Lolita, meanwhile, continued taking notes steadily, each word like a blade cutting through the mask of false politeness in that room. It was a silent resistance, persistent, resilient, and full of quiet dignity. She didn't need to shout to fight back. She just needed not to retreat. And that was exactly what unsettled Miss Lauren more than anything else. Monday morning. The atmosphere in the classroom was still as heavy as before. But this time, something was different. The target had been locked in. When Lolita stepped through the classroom door, Miss Lauren turned from the board, her gaze sharp as a blade. Miss King, am I seeing you chewing gum? Lolita froze for a second. She was holding her pen, writing the title in her notebook. There was absolutely nothing in her mouth. No, ma'am, I'm not. Don't lie to me, Miss Lauren snapped, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. Spit it out, right now. The whole class turned to look. A few furrowed their brows. Others tried to suppress a laugh. Lolita stood up. Without another word, she calmly walked to the trash bin and pretended to spit out a non-existent piece of gum. Then she returned to her seat and sat down as though she hadn't just been publicly humiliated in front of the class. But her eyes, this time, were no longer silent. They were burning. Miss Lauren continued. For the rest of the lesson, not a single detail about Lolita went unpunished. Sit up straight. This isn't a hair salon. Write more clearly. How is anyone supposed to read that? Focus. Stop daydreaming. This is literature, not a fashion show. Strangely, every single comment was directed at only one person. Lolita said nothing, but her hand began to grip the pen so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Each word she wrote was no longer graceful but bold and firm, as if that was the only way she could hold on to her dignity. From the front row, Sarah glanced at her again, her eyes filled with inner conflict. The quiet snickers continued from the back of the room every time Miss Lauren threw in a mocking remark. On one side, the silence of those who understood. On the other, the delight of those empowered by prejudice. And in the middle was a girl trying not to fall apart. Wednesday. The literature class was unusually buzzing. Today was group presentation day. Each student was to choose an aspect of To Kill a Mockingbird to present. Lolita stood up, holding a meticulously prepared presentation board, striking quotes, a character analysis chart, and the central theme, racial injustice and moral courage. She stood before the class, back straight, eyes confident. Knowing she was stepping onto a battlefield, she did not back down. The novel isn't just about Atticus Finch and a trial, but a profound indictment of systemic bias in society. Miss King, Miss Lauren's voice cut in, soft, to the point of being fake. I'm just curious, why did you choose this topic? Don't you think you're overemphasizing one particular aspect? The room tensed. Lolita took a deep breath, staying calm. I believe that to understand this novel truly, we can't separate race from its core moral message. I know the novel well. Miss Lauren interrupted again, her voice colder now. But I think you're letting personal bias overshadow literary analysis. A quiet ooh rippled from the back of the class. A few glances were exchanged. Lolita stood silently for a few seconds. Then she responded, her voice unmistakably clear. My analysis is based on textual evidence and academic references. It fully meets the assignment requirements. Miss Lauren stood. The screech of her chair against the floor was chilling. She walked over and stood between Lolita and the rest of the class, like a wall of authority. I need to clarify something, she said, her tone sharp. Constantly harping on race not only derails the topic but disrupts this class. Maybe at your previous school, that kind of one-sided approach was acceptable. But here, we expect more rigorous scholarship. The class went silent. Sarah gripped the edge of her desk. Dylan looked down at his shoes. No one laughed anymore. A line had been crossed. Lolita stood there, her eyes turning red, but no tears falling. She answered softly but firmly. Then I suppose you'd also agree that avoiding the topic of race is distorting the very message the author intended. A long, suffocating silence followed. That's enough, Miss Lauren snapped. You have an attitude problem. If you're not willing to follow the standards of this classroom, perhaps you should reconsider your place here. Lolita bowed and began packing her materials, her hands trembling slightly. But then a small voice rose from the back of the class. I think Lolita's presentation was excellent. Everyone turned. It was Peterson, the quietest student in the room. Miss Lauren whipped around. And you think you're qualified to evaluate literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Or would you like to join Miss King in the principal's office? Peterson lowered his head, silent. A fog of shame spread across the room. Lolita returned to her seat, but she did not collapse. Her back was still straight, her hand still wrote, and in her eyes no longer rage but a will forged from the humiliation Miss Lauren had tried to hand her. The class had just ended. The bell rang like an escape route, but for Lolita, it sounded more like the drum roll for an impending silent confrontation. As the other students pushed their way out of the classroom, Miss Lauren spoke in a soft voice laced with hidden meaning. Miss King, stay for a moment. I need to have a word with you. Lolita stood still. She had known this moment would come. This wasn't a conversation. It was a hearing. Miss Lauren slowly returned to her desk, sat down, and adjusted her blouse, like someone preparing for a speech. No one was left in the room, just the two of them, and a raw truth was lying between them. I'm genuinely concerned about your attitude in class lately, she began, her voice sharp as a blade. Your emotional comments, constant challenges to me, the instructor, and the way you always seem to act is special. She paused, tilting her head, staring deep into Lolita's eyes. I've been teaching here for over 15 years, and I know what kind of student fits into a serious academic environment. Lolita stood her ground. No reaction, no bowing of the head, no flinching. If you feel you can't adapt to the standards at Harrison West, Miss Lauren continued, her tone now lower, then perhaps another environment would suit you better. That sentence, though disguised in polite language, was a knife in truth. Get out, you don't belong here. Lolita took a deep breath. Her chest tightened, but when she spoke, her voice remained strong. What have I done wrong besides offering a different perspective? I come to class, turn in my work on time, and participate based on the book and research. But I don't please you, because I refuse to stay silent. Miss Lauren laughed, a dry, brittle laugh, as if she were hearing a fanciful tale. You're smart, Miss King, But being smart doesn't mean you belong. I'll be calling your parents. Some boundaries need to be set before things go too far. Lolita didn't nod, didn't reply. She looked directly at the woman before her, the woman who was using her authority to turn prejudice into policy, with eyes full of something Miss Lauren would never understand, the quiet fire of someone born to break molds. I'll be there, Lolita said, then turned to leave. And so will my father. At that moment, though no one knew what would come next, a storm had gathered above Miss Lauren's head. Because what she didn't know was that the man she was planning to call in for a meeting was not just a father. That evening, in the third-floor faculty office of Harrison West High, Miss Lauren sat under the warm glow of her desk lamp, a smug expression on her face as she typed an email. Subject, parent meeting. Student, Lolita King. Body. I propose a meeting with Miss King's parent, after class on Thursday, to discuss her attitude, academic methods, and overall ability to adapt to the expectations of an advanced classroom environment. Early intervention is necessary to avoid long-term consequences. She signed off with complete authority. Lauren Whitaker, Senior Literature Instructor, Harrison West High. Then she leaned back in her chair, a triumphant smile spreading. In her mind, the upcoming meeting would be the final blow, the scene where she would paint Lolita as uncooperative, disruptive to authority, lacking humility, onanistic, playing the victim. It is a performance carefully crafted, just waiting for the audience and for naive parents to show up and listen. But there was one thing she didn't know. She had chosen the wrong stage. Underscore 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 underscore. When Lolita walked into class the next day, there was no trace of anger, only a deep calm unsettled, a silence not of someone enduring, but of someone prepared. Miss Lauren noticed, but only curled her lips into a smirk. Staying calm before the storm is a defense, she thought. But no one survives the storm without shelter. And she was convinced that Lolita would have no choice but to retreat after the meeting, because Lolita had no one, because the teacher held the power, because parents usually only hear one side, right? No, not this time. Underscore 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 Thursday afternoon. Faint sunlight filtered through the hallway windows. Lolita sat quietly in the classroom, clutching her backpack strap, her eyes fixed on the door. Then came footsteps, steady, purposeful. The door opened. A tall man in a dark blue suit stepped inside, composed and commanding. His eyes scanned the silent room and landed on the girl, sitting calmly in her seat. Lolita smiled gently. Miss Lauren squinted, momentarily confused. "Excuse me, and you are?" she asked, approaching. The man extended his hand, his voice calm, yet filled with unmistakable weight. "I'm the principal of this school, Mr. David King, and I'm also Lolita King's father." Miss Lauren froze, a flicker of shock, then disbelief, then complete silence. Everything she had written, every word she had planned to say, would now have to stand before the highest authority in the entire school. And not just a principal, but a father. The air in the classroom turned heavy as lead. Ms. Lauren stood frozen in front of the man who had just introduced himself as David King, the principal of the school and Lolita's father. The forced smile on her lips vanished like steam in a cold wind. "Principal King, I didn't know that. She was your daughter." Principal King's expression didn't change. His voice remained calm, but colder than the fluorescent lights overhead. "I'm sorry, Ms. Lauren, but my relationship with my daughter has no bearing on the fairness I expect within this school." Ms. Lauren swallowed hard, attempting a weak smile. "Of course. I just thought we could have a private meeting to clarify some of the academic issues she's facing." Mr. King tilted his head. "I think it's best that you speak clearly. Right here." He turned to face the class, where every pair of eyes was locked in, as though watching a scene unfold from a film. Then he turned back, his gaze sharp as a freshly honed blade. "You seem to have quite a list of concerns regarding Student King. Well then, please go ahead." Ms. Lauren struggled to gather herself. She opened her laptop, pulled a folder from her leather bag, and began speaking, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, Lolita has exhibited behavior that is inappropriate toward the instructor. She frequently imposes her viewpoints, especially on political topics, which disrupts the class. I'm just concerned that she may not be adjusting well to our advanced academic environment." Principal King gave a slight nod, not interrupting. He let her continue, like a judge listening carefully before delivering a verdict. "Additionally," Lauren went on, starting to falter, "she's shown a challenging attitude, often reacts when I provide feedback, especially during her most recent presentation." Mr. King looked up, his voice deep and clear. "Was that the presentation on To Kill a Mockingbird?" "Yes, that's right. And what topic did my daughter choose?" Lauren hesitated, then reluctantly answered, "She focused too heavily on themes of race and social injustice, which I felt lacked objectivity and were overly personalized." Mr. King placed the folder gently on the desk. His voice was no longer calm. It carried the weight of a storm, restrained only by discipline and intellect. "Ms. Lauren, you're referring to a novel about a black man wrongly accused and condemned by society because of the color of his skin. And you think discussing racism is inappropriate?" Lauren opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Do you believe that a black student speaking about racism is lacking objectivity, or is it simply that you refuse to listen?" She stood stunned. Beads of sweat began forming on her temples. "I have listened to both sides, Ms. Lauren," Mr. King continued, his gaze sweeping across the breathless classroom. "I've read my daughter's essay. I've seen another student secretly filmed the video when she was reprimanded for chewing non-existent gum. I've heard the sarcasm about her pronunciation, her culture, her attitude." Lauren stepped back. Her face went pale. Mr. King turned to the class, his voice slow but resonant like a drumbeat. "Dear students, education is not about forcing ideology, nor is it about suppressing the voices of the vulnerable. If a classroom makes students afraid to raise their hands, speak, and be themselves, then that is no longer education. It is manipulation." No one spoke, but Lolita's eyes, the same eyes that had so often been ignored, now gleamed with a light finally acknowledged. Ms. Lauren stood motionless. Her entire posture shifted as though she had just realized the meeting she had orchestrated was a reckoning for herself, and beyond the classroom door, history had just begun to change. After Principal David King's words cut through the air like a blade, Ms. Lauren could only stand silently. Her eyes lowered to the floor, her hands clutching the once carefully prepared file. Now, nothing more than a stack of meaningless papers. The entire Harrison West High classroom seemed to hold its breath. No laughter, no note-taking, no one shifted in their seat. Everyone watched, the moment when power changed hands. Mr. King nodded to the class. "Please continue reading the next section of the novel. I'll return shortly. Right now, Ms. Lauren and I need to have a private discussion." He turned and opened the door. Ms. Lauren had no choice. She followed him like a shadow being led, no longer proud or authoritative. Upstairs, in a small meeting room. The door closed. No more students, no more watching eyes. Just two adults. And a truth that could no longer be hidden. Mr. King poured 2 glasses of water, placing one in front of Ms. Lauren, though she didn't touch it. "I invite you to sit," he said calmly, though his eyes held no warmth. "But if you're more comfortable standing, that's fine too." Ms. Lauren hesitantly sat down, her voice barely above a whisper. I sincerely apologize, Principal King. I didn't know. I had no idea." Mr. King cut her off, not with volume, but with precision. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing I'm Lolita's father. You should apologize for how you've treated a student, simply because she's black." Silence, as if the oxygen had been sucked from the room. "Did you know," he continued, "that in the past 3 months I received 5 anonymous emails from students describing your behavior, but I didn't act, because I didn't yet have enough proof. And now I do." Lauren bowed her head, her face drained of color. I just wanted to maintain standards in my classroom. Maybe I've been too rigid, but I never meant to discriminate." "Never meant to?" Mr. King's eyes locked onto hers. "You mocked her pronunciation. You cut her off every time she spoke. You said she didn't meet the standard, because she chose to speak on race in a book that's literally about race. You call that academic rigor, or is it bias in the disguise of scholarship?" Ms. Lauren was speechless. At that moment, she was no longer a teacher. She was the defendant in a courtroom, without a gavel. "I will forward the class recordings, student testimonies, and the video my daughter herself provided to the school board," Mr. King declared, "because this is no longer just a classroom matter." Lauren whispered, nearly choking on the words, "I'm going to lose everything." "You will lose exactly what you believed you had the right to control," Mr. King replied, his voice now as cold as steel. "You're not losing because of a student. You're losing because of an ideology that has rotted from the inside, and you chose to preserve it at all costs." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "You may return to the classroom to collect your belongings, but after today, you are no longer permitted to teach at Harrison West High." Ms. Lauren didn't respond. She nodded, then walked out like a mute shadow of her former self. In the hallway, as the door opened, the classroom remained quiet. Lolita sat at her desk, eyes fixed on her father. No words were spoken, yet everything was understood. Principal King returned to the front of the class, his voice deep but steady. "I believe it's time we have a serious conversation about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education." When Principal David King walked back into the classroom, Ms. Lauren followed him, her face pale, her eyes vacant, clutching her folder like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The classroom suddenly felt smaller. It was no longer an English literature class. It was a silent courtroom, with witnesses seated in the front row. Mr. King stopped at the center of the room. His voice rose, deep, deliberate, and powerful, without needing to be loud. "I stand here today, not just as a principal, but as a father, and as someone who believes every student deserves to be heard." He turned to Ms. Lauren. "Do you have anything to say to your class?" Lauren opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Mr. King gave a slight nod, then continued, this time addressing all the students. "I've heard far too much about what has taken place in this classroom. Students ignored, cut off, mocked for their accents, skin color, and different perspectives on the world. This is a classroom, not a trench. No one comes to school to be diminished simply for asking questions." The air thickened, on the verge of bursting. Some students lowered their heads, others nodded quietly, And some, the ones who used to smirk whenever Lolita was humiliated, now couldn't bear to meet her eyes. Principal King took a step back, directing his gaze at the person who once led this room. Ms. Lauren, what you've done isn't just a personal mistake. You created an environment where students feared their thoughts, feared being ridiculed for speaking, feared being labeled simply because they didn't fit what you were used to seeing. He paused, then delivered the final line. And that is why you will no longer be teaching in this classroom today. No applause, no cheers, just a collective sense of relief, like someone had finally lifted a weight that had been crushing every chest for far too long. Lauren quietly turned and walked out of the room. When the door closed behind her, an era ended, not because one student dared to speak up, but because all the silent ones had started to look inward. Principal King stood before the class once more, his voice slow but unwavering. I'm sorry you had to witness this, but I believe it's better to confront truth than to continue living in silence. Starting tomorrow, this class will be led by a new teacher, someone who understands that difference is not a threat, but the foundation of real thinking. He turned and looked at Lolita, eyes filled with pride. The young girl sat there, eyes glistening with tears, but stronger than ever. Ms. Lauren left the classroom in silence. No one saw her off. No eyes clung to her as she walked away. Only her footsteps echoed through the hallway, a corridor she once walked with pride. Now, the cardboard box in her hands, filled with lesson plans, books, photo frames, and an old pen, was all that remained after over a decade of teaching. As she stepped outside the gates of Harrison West High, a few students peeked from behind the windows. They said nothing, didn't smile, didn't cheer, only silence. Not because they were satisfied, but because they had finally understood. An adult can walk away, but the scars they leave behind can last forever unless someone dares to speak up. That afternoon, the school board held an emergency meeting. Principal King presented the complete documentation, student testimonies, and recorded footage. In less than 2 hours, the decision was made. Lauren Whitaker was permanently terminated from her teaching position at Harrison West High. A brief notice was posted on the teacher's bulletin board the next morning. No fanfare, no embellishment, just a statement as clear and sharp as a wake-up call to the entire school system. The next morning, Lolita walked into class with a strange feeling. No more sneering looks, no more whispered judgments. Instead, direct eye contact, polite nods, and even encouraging smiles. On her desk lay a neatly folded note. I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. Thank you for your courage. Sarah, front row. Lolita read it and smiled, not because of the apology, but because it carried hope. That afternoon, a group of students gathered in the small library behind the school courtyard. A few friends had started brainstorming an idea to form an inclusion and multicultural club. The first person invited to be its advisor was Lolita King. She didn't decline. If we don't change things, who will? And if not today, when? During lunch, Principal King sat beside his daughter. He didn't say much. He just sat quietly next to her, his expression softening. You did something many adults still lack the courage to do, he said. And you've taught me something. Justice doesn't live in a title. It lives in what we do. Lolita gave a gentle nod. No need for grand words, because what she had done was already powerful enough to create a new truth. Monday morning. Harrison West High welcomed the start of a new week with a completely different atmosphere. No longer the heavyweight that sank into the hallways every time the bell rang. No more wary glances when a black student walked into class. Now, there was laughter, friendly greetings, and a quiet sense of hope blooming in every corner of the school. Lolita King walked through the school gates, hair neatly tied back, backpack slung over one shoulder like always. But today, her posture was different. No more hesitation, no more guardedness. Instead, the confident stride of someone who had faced the dark and stepped out holding the light. In literature class, the whiteboard displayed a bold message. This week's theme, Voices Forgotten. Temporary teacher. Mr. Rowland, a brown-skinned young man with a warm smile. We're going to read, listen, and rewrite history, from more than just one point of view, he said, looking directly at the class. This room will be a place where your voices won't be left behind. Lolita sat in the third row. A few classmates leaned over, asking, "What do you think of the essay prompt? Can we be in a group together?" She smiled. Not because she was popular, but because finally she was seen as a person, truly seen. During recess, the library hosted the first meeting of the new multicultural club. One student suggested a cultural heritage day. Another proposal is to invite Black alums to share their stories. Lolita was nominated as the honorary president of the club. She politely declined the title. "I don't want to be the center. I want to create space for everyone to be themselves." They applauded, not because it sounded poetic, but because it was real. Lolita and her father walked out of the school together. As they passed the parking lot, the space where Ms. Lauren's car used to sit still stood empty. Principal King glanced at his daughter and asked softly, "Do you think things have truly changed?" Lolita paused for a few seconds, then replied gently, "Not yet. But at least I'm not fighting alone anymore. And that's where change begins, right?" He nodded, unable to hide his pride. The sky that day blazed with sunlight, not just over the rooftops of Harrison West High, but in the hearts of those who once stayed silent and now had learned to rise. Because justice doesn't come overnight. It begins with someone brave enough to speak, someone brave enough to stand, so that others don't have to keep their heads down. And today, a new dawn had truly begun. In one classroom that had once been filled with prejudice, a new dawn had truly begun.